Why the Tower of Babel makes no sense. 5 fingerprints, hidden in Genesis. 11. You may have misunderstood the Tower of Babel for most of your life, not because you failed to pay attention, not because you lacked intelligence, and perhaps not even because anyone deliberately deceived you. You misunderstood it because you were taught to approach the story from a particular direction before you were old enough to ask whether that direction made sense. 9 verses in Genesis 11. A city, a tower, one language, a divine intervention, humanity scattered across the earth. Most people first encounter the story through simple images. Workers carrying bricks, a giant tower disappearing into the clouds, frightened people suddenly speaking languages no one around them understands. And the lesson is usually just as simple. Human beings became proud. They tried to reach God. God humbled them. Therefore, do not become arrogant. It is neat, memorable, morally useful. But the moment you stop reading the story as a childhood lesson and begin examining it as a human document, something changes. Details that once seemed harmless become strangely revealing. Questions appear. Why does the narrator care so much about bricks? Why does God have to come down to inspect a tower supposedly reaching heaven? Why does Genesis 10 already describe humanity as divided into nations and languages before Genesis 11 claims everyone speaks one language? Why does the name Babel receive a Hebrew explanation even though Babylon was not a Hebrew city? And why does the God of the story appear disturbed not by violence, cruelty, or oppression, but by human cooperation? Those questions do not disappear when you look more closely. They multiply. And this is where Baruch Spinoza becomes important. Spinoza approached Scripture with a principle that was dangerous in his own century and remains uncomfortable even now. A sacred text should not be protected from examination merely because generations have called it sacred. A text must be allowed to reveal its history, its language, its tension, its human motives, its seams. If something appears contradictory, we should not immediately invent a theological explanation to save it. We should first ask what the contradiction tells us about the document itself. That method changes Babel completely. To understand why, imagine the world behind the story. In the reading we are examining, the author is not sitting peacefully in some isolated landscape, dreaming about humanity's distant past. He belongs to a defeated people living under the shadow of Babylon. Jerusalem has been devastated. Its political independence has collapsed. Its temple, the symbolic center of religious, cultural, and national life, has been destroyed. Its ruling order has been broken. Families have been displaced. A conquered population now finds itself surrounded by a civilization larger, wealthier, more technologically sophisticated, and culturally overwhelming. And above the city rises Babylon's monumental architecture. Imagine what that would do to a person. Every morning you awaken inside the empire that defeated you. You walk streets more impressive than anything in your homeland. You hear a foreign language used in administration, trade, education, and opportunity. Your children begin learning that language more easily than your own. You watch younger generations become fascinated by the stories, customs, wealth, and possibilities of the civilization surrounding them. Then you look upward. There stands the great tower, not merely a building, a declaration, an empire made visible, stone, or rather brick, turned into ideology. Your civilization lost. Theirs won. Their city flourishes. Yours lies wounded in memory. What do you do with that humiliation? You could assimilate. You could accept that history has delivered its verdict. You could allow your people to dissolve gradually into the victorious culture, as conquered peoples have done countless times. Or you could reinterpret the meaning of victory itself. You could take the empire's monument and turn it into evidence not of Babylon's greatness, but of Babylon's foolishness. You could write a story. And this is where the first fingerprint appears. Genesis pauses almost immediately to tell us something strangely technical. The people say, in effect, "Let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." Then the text explains that bricks served them for stone and bitumen for mortar. Why is that detail there? Think about how strange it is. We are supposedly reading one of the great primordial stories of humanity, a story involving God, civilization, language, and the destiny of nations. And suddenly the narration becomes interested in building materials. Bricks, kilns, bitumen. It is almost as though someone describing the rise of Manhattan interrupted the story to explain that modern builders use steel beams and glass windows. Why mention what should have been obvious? For someone raised in Mesopotamia, brick construction was not miraculous technology. It was ordinary life. The great river plains did not offer the same abundance of building stone found elsewhere. Mud was everywhere. For generations, people had learned to shape it, dry it, fire it, and turn it into durable architecture. To a Babylonian, saying that Babylonians built with bricks would be like telling a modern reader that people drove cars using wheels. The detail becomes interesting only from the perspective of an outsider, someone from a region where construction traditions were different, someone who arrived and saw an ordinary Babylonian technique with unfamiliar eyes. Imagine a Judean encountering Babylon for the first time. Back home, stone was familiar. Here, mud had been transformed into vast walls, temples, gates, terraces, and towers. A substance associated with dirt had become architecture. What looked trivial in one environment had become monumental through knowledge. The visitor may have understood neither the chemistry nor the engineering, but he understood the result. Babylon could build things his own society could not. And suddenly Genesis 11:3 begins to sound less like divine instruction and more like culture shock. The amazement belongs not to an omniscient creator. It belongs to a human observer. An infinite intelligence would not discover Killeen-fired brick with surprise. It would not need to pause the history of civilization to note the usefulness of bitumen. But a displaced man, seeing these materials used at an astonishing scale, might. That small detail matters because texts often reveal their authors most clearly when the author is not consciously trying to reveal anything. We expose ourselves through what surprises us, through what we consider worth explaining, through what we assume our audience also needs explained. A person who writes, "They had brick instead of stone," has already told you something about the world from which he is looking. He knows stone. Brick requires explanation, and that means the story may contain something far more interesting than a supernatural construction report. It contains the perspective of someone standing between cultures, someone impressed by Babylon and perhaps ashamed of being impressed, someone surrounded by evidence of another civilization's power while desperately needing to believe that power did not mean superiority. That is the first fingerprint. Not yet a proof of everything that follows, but a crack, a small distortion in the glass. And once you notice it, another detail becomes impossible to ignore. Because the writer does not merely describe Babylonian greatness. He does something psychologically more revealing. He begins to shrink it. And to understand how he does that, we have to look upward at the tower itself. The people announce their ambition. They will build a city and a tower whose top reaches into the heavens, and they will make a name for themselves. That phrase has carried enormous theological weight. A tower reaching heaven. It sounds like rebellion on an architectural scale. Humanity appears to be climbing toward the divine realm, threatening a boundary that should never be crossed. But before treating that image literally, ask a simpler question. How high could such a tower actually have been? The monumental ziggurat associated with Babylon was impressive, especially when seen from ground level in the ancient world. It rose above a flat landscape and dominated the city's sacred architecture, but it was still a human building, not a stairway piercing the atmosphere, not a structure approaching the stars, not a platform from which human beings could threaten an infinite deity. This matters because perspective changes everything. Stand at the bottom of a large monument and look straight upward. Your body immediately tells you a story. The structure feels enormous. You feel small. Its height becomes emotional before it becomes mathematical. Now imagine that the monument belongs to the empire that defeated you. Its apparent size is no longer merely physical. It becomes political. Every brick says, "We had the knowledge to build this." Every terrace says, "We had the labor, organization, wealth, and stability to accomplish what your people could not." The tower is not simply taller than you. The civilization is. This is where the story becomes psychologically fascinating. The author cannot make Babylon's tower disappear. He cannot build a greater one. He cannot reverse military defeat. But he can change the scale against which the tower is measured. And Genesis 11 does exactly that. The humans build upward. Then comes one of the strangest sentences in the story. The Lord comes down to see the city and the tower. Down. That word destroys the tower's pretension. Humans believe they are reaching heaven. Yet from the divine perspective, their structure is apparently so insignificant that God must descend merely to inspect it. The effect is almost comic. The builders shout, "Look how high we have risen." The narrator answers, "High. God had to come down just to find you." Now the passage begins to sound like satire. And satire is one of the oldest weapons available to powerless people. If you cannot defeat an empire militarily, you can ridicule its symbols. If you cannot destroy its monuments, you can attack what those monuments mean. If the conqueror says, "This tower proves our greatness," the captive can answer, "Your tower is so small that heaven barely notices it." The physical building remains exactly where it was, but psychologically, it has been reduced. This is the second fingerprint. The narrator may feel small, so his God becomes immeasurably large. Babylon may possess the tower, but Israel's God possesses the scale against which all towers become ridiculous. That move is intellectually elegant. It is also deeply human. People have always compensated symbolically for what they cannot control materially. A defeated nation remembers moral superiority. A poor community emphasizes spiritual wealth. A politically powerless group imagines judgment beyond politics. None of these responses is automatically false, but they become revealing when human emotional needs are placed directly into the mind of God. Because then we have to ask a dangerous question. Are we discovering God's perspective? Or are we discovering what a wounded human being needed God's perspective to be? Spinoza's approach pushes us toward that distinction. Human beings continually imagine God through the structure of their own emotions. When we fear, we imagine divine fear. When we desire revenge, we imagine divine vengeance. When we are offended, we imagine heaven offended. When we love our own community, we may imagine that the architecture of the universe shares our tribal loyalties. The problem is not merely religious, it is epistemological. We confuse our response to reality with reality itself. A frightened person does not merely say, "I am afraid." He begins seeing danger everywhere. An angry person does not simply admit, "I am angry." He begins interpreting the world as though the world itself had become offensive. Our affects color perception, and unless we understand their causes, we mistake color for truth. That is exactly why the Babel story becomes so interesting from a Spinoza-inspired perspective. Instead of asking only what the text says about God, we can ask what the text reveals about the human beings producing and preserving it. What emotional conditions might generate this image of God? What political defeat? What cultural insecurity? What need for dignity? What fear of being swallowed by something larger? Once you begin reading that way, the passage no longer floats above history. It enters history. And human documents behave differently from divine dictation. Human documents have contexts. They have authors. They have communities. They carry memories. They preserve conflicts. They inherit older traditions. And sometimes those traditions contradict one another. Which brings us to the third fingerprint. This one does not require psychological speculation. You do not need to guess what anyone felt. You only need to turn back one chapter. Genesis 10 is one of those sections most readers hurry through. Names, genealogies, nations, descendants, territories. It feels like administrative paperwork inserted between more memorable stories. But buried in that list is a detail repeated several times. Different peoples are described according to their clans, lands, nations, and languages. Languages, plural. Humanity is already geographically and linguistically divided. People have spread into separate regions. Communities possess distinct identities. Their speech has diversified. The situation is presented as established reality. Now turn the page. Genesis 11 begins. The whole earth had one language and the same words. Immediately, we have a problem. In the chapter before Babel, humanity already has many languages. At the beginning of Babel, humanity has one. The ordinary reader often misses this because chapters create psychological distance. We remember the famous story and forget the genealogy preceding it, but place the claims beside one another and the seam becomes visible. First, nations with their own languages. Then, everyone speaks one language. What happened? Did history reverse itself between verses? Did distinct linguistic communities suddenly forget their differences? Or are we looking at two traditions placed beside each other? That possibility is far more important than Babel alone, because if different traditions can exist side by side, even when their explanations do not perfectly agree, then Scripture begins to look less like a single voice, speaking from outside history, and more like a library assembled within history. One tradition explains linguistic diversity naturally. Peoples spread, separated geographically, developed different communities, and came to speak differently. Another tradition gives the diversity a dramatic origin. Humanity once spoke together, built together, And then divine intervention, fractured communication. Both stories answer the same question. Why do different people speak different languages? But they answer it differently. A modern editor might choose one. An ancient compiler could preserve both. And if both mattered to different communities, preserving both may have been more important than harmonizing them. This is precisely the kind of phenomenon Spinoza wanted readers to face without fear. If a contradiction exists in the text, do not insult your own intelligence by pretending you cannot see it. Examine it. Ask what historical process could have produced it. Look for causes, because understanding the cause of a contradiction is more illuminating than inventing a miracle to hide it. And here the image of Spinoza himself becomes almost impossible to resist. He spent his working life with lenses, glass, surfaces, distortion, clarity. A lens is useful only if it allows you to see what is actually there rather than what you want to be there. The same discipline can be applied to texts. And when the lens is turned toward Genesis 10 and 11, the seam comes sharply into focus. But that seam is only the beginning, because the next fingerprint is hidden not in the structure of the chapters, but inside one word. The word I asked you to remember, gate. The climax of Babel comes with the explanation of the city's name. The story tells us that the place came to be called Babel because there the language of humanity was confused. To a Hebrew-speaking audience, the wordplay is effective. Babel is associated with a Hebrew verb connected to confusion. The sound supports the story. The city becomes linguistically branded by its punishment. Babylon is no longer merely an imperial capital. Its name itself appears to testify against it. Confusion, disorder, babbling. A civilization that considered itself the center of greatness becomes, in Hebrew memory, a monument to failed human ambition. But now remember the word, gate. The people who lived in Babylon did not name their own city with a Hebrew pun. Why would they? Their language and cultural world were different. Within the Babylonian linguistic setting described by the source, the city's name carried an entirely different prestige. The name was associated with the idea of a gate of the god. Gate. Now the earlier clue returns. To the Babylonians, this was not a city proudly announcing confusion. Quite the opposite. The name expressed connection, sacred geography, a point where earthly and divine order met. The great religious structures of Babylon were not built because the inhabitants believed they were stupidly trying to break into heaven by force. They belonged to a religious worldview in which sacred architecture represented communication between levels of reality. The tower's meaning, in its own culture, was therefore almost the reverse of the Hebrew satire. For Babylon, connection. For the Hebrew story, confusion. For Babylon, sacred gateway. For Genesis 11, divine disruption. That reversal is too important to overlook. Imagine someone taking the most honorable name in your culture and explaining it through the vocabulary of humiliation in theirs. Suppose your city had a name meaning place of wisdom, but a rival language contained a similar-sounding word meaning fool. Now imagine that rival writing a sacred history claiming your city was actually named because its founders were fools. After enough generations, readers who never knew your language might believe the insult was the original meaning. That is the power of narrative. Military conquest controls territory. Narrative conquest controls memory. A defeated people may lose land and still win the future interpretation of the civilization that defeated them. That possibility makes Babel much more than a myth about language. It becomes a struggle over naming. And naming is never trivial. To name something is to frame it. The frame determines what later generations notice. Call an event a rebellion, and you see criminals. Call the same event a revolution, and you see liberators. Call separation purity, and it becomes virtue. Call unity rebellion, and cooperation begins to appear dangerous. The physical facts may remain identical while their moral meaning changes completely. Spinoza was suspicious of precisely this mechanism. Language can reveal reality, but language can also bind emotion to reality so tightly that people forget the difference. A word carries fear. A name carries hatred. A story carries loyalty. Eventually, the inherited emotional reaction feels self-evident. You no longer remember why Babylon should mean confusion. It simply does. You no longer examine the origin of the association. The story has become the lens through which you see. And this is why textual criticism can feel threatening. It does more than offer new information. It interrupts inherited emotion. It asks you to separate the thing itself from the story you were taught about the thing. The city exists. The Hebrew interpretation exists. The Babylonian interpretation exists. The question is whether one should be mistaken for an objective divine definition of the other. From the perspective developed in this script, the Babel wordplay therefore becomes the fourth fingerprint. The writer does not merely describe Babylon, he renames it. He takes the empire's sacred self-understanding and reverses its emotional charge. The gate becomes babbling, connection becomes confusion, greatness becomes embarrassment, and the reversal serves a psychological purpose. The conquered can now look at the conqueror's greatest city and say, "You misunderstand yourselves. You think this place is a gateway to heaven? Our God says it is the birthplace of confusion. You call your tower holy. Our story calls it ridiculous. You think your unity demonstrates power. Our theology says your unity provoked divine intervention. What could an army accomplish that is more enduring than that? Armies destroy buildings. Stories can destroy prestige. An empire can rebuild a wall. It cannot easily control what enemies will say about it for the next 3,000 years. That is why resentment expressed through literature should never be underestimated. It can become inheritance, and once inheritance becomes sacred, later generations may forget that the original conflict ever existed. The insult survives after the insulted civilization disappears. But there is a larger issue. The first fingerprint concerned unusual fascination with construction. The second concerned the psychological shrinking of Babylon through divine scale. The third exposed incompatible accounts of linguistic diversity. The fourth appeared in the reinterpretation of Babylon's name. Each raises questions about human authorship, but the fifth fingerprint reaches deeper. It concerns the character of God inside the story itself. Return to the moment after God comes down. He sees the people united. They share a language. They cooperate. They organize collectively. They have begun a vast project. And then comes the line that should stop us. The text presents God as observing that the people are one, that this is only the beginning, and that nothing they plan will be beyond them. Read the emotional structure of that scene. Human beings are cooperating. God becomes concerned. Human beings become capable. God intervenes. Their unity increases their power. God fractures their unity. Why? If God is infinite, what exactly could human cooperation threaten? This is where the traditional reading begins to strain. An unlimited reality cannot lose power because finite beings coordinate their efforts. If human beings build higher buildings, infinity does not become smaller. If human beings discover new technologies, the laws of nature are not dethroned. If humanity learns to communicate across difference, the structure of reality does not become endangered. To fear something is to believe that something valuable may be lost. To feel threatened is to perceive a rival power. To become anxious about the future is to confront uncertainty. But can an infinite God meaningfully experience insecurity in that human sense? Spinoza's answer would force us to reconsider the image completely. For Spinoza, God is not a superhuman monarch sitting somewhere above nature, watching earthly events with changing moods. God is not flattered today, angry tomorrow, jealous the next day, then reassured after punishing someone. Those are human passions. To assign them to the infinite is not to elevate God. It is to enlarge humanity. We take the emotional architecture of a human ruler and project it onto existence itself. A king fears rebellion, so we imagine God fearing rebellion. A ruler worries when subjects unite, so we imagine heaven worrying when humans become one people. A threatened authority divides opposition, so the story's God divides language. And now the uncomfortable question becomes unavoidable. Whose anxiety are we actually hearing? When a deity behaves like a frightened political ruler, Spinoza would ask us to examine the human imagination behind the image. Not because every religious statement is automatically false, but because human beings tend to interpret unknown causes through familiar emotional models. Ancient people hear thunder and imagine anger. They survive a catastrophe and imagine favor. Their enemies prosper and they imagine divine testing. Their enemies collapse and they imagine judgment. The imagination fills causal gaps with intention. Spinoza regarded that habit as one of the great sources of superstition. We experience events. We do not understand their full causes, but uncertainty is uncomfortable. So instead of saying, "I do not yet understand why this happened," we create a story. Someone wanted it. Someone punished us. Someone rewarded us. Someone is angry. Someone has a plan. The universe becomes psychologically easier to inhabit once it begins behaving like a person. But psychological comfort is not evidence. And in Babel, the human emotional structure becomes unusually visible. Ask who would actually fear a unified Babylonian civilization, not the infinite order of existence, not the creator of galaxies, not a being whose power, by definition, has no competitor, but a small displaced community inside the empire? Yes. A priest trying to preserve that community? Certainly. A parent watching children adopt a foreign language? Absolutely. A defeated people terrified that cultural integration will erase the last remains of their identity? Now the story begins to make sense. This is the point where the 5 fingerprints begin converging. The writer is impressed by Babylonian technology. He mocks Babylon's tower by making God descend to see it. The surrounding text preserves different traditions about language. Babylon's honorable name is transformed into a Hebrew joke about confusion, and finally God appears worried by human unity. What single historical fear could connect all of those elements? Assimilation. This fear is quieter than warfare. That is precisely what makes it dangerous. A conqueror who persecutes you can strengthen your identity. Oppression gives communities a clear enemy. People know who they are because they know who is trying to destroy them. But what happens when the empire does not need to destroy you? What happens when it merely invites you to belong? Imagine the exiles living in Babylon. They build homes. They trade. They raise families. They learn how the economy works. They form relationships with neighbors. Their children grow up surrounded by Babylonian language. Young people naturally notice the prestige of the dominant culture. Its buildings are greater. Its institutions are powerful. Its stories are everywhere. Its language opens doors. Its gods appear to belong to the civilization that won. Nothing forces assimilation. That is the problem. It happens through ordinary life. A child finds the foreign language easier. A merchant uses it because customers do. A young person makes friends outside the community. Someone falls in love. Another family stops practicing an old custom because it feels inconvenient. One generation still remembers Jerusalem. The next remembers stories about Jerusalem. The third remembers almost nothing. No army is required. Identity disappears through comfort. This is one of the deepest patterns in human history. Cultures often survive direct attack more easily than they survive absorption. Violence creates resistance. Attraction creates imitation. And imitation can accomplish what violence cannot. The threatened priest therefore faces a difficult problem. How do you preserve a boundary when the physical boundary no longer exists? Jerusalem's walls cannot protect people living in Babylon. Geography cannot separate them. Military power is gone. Political sovereignty is gone. The community is surrounded. So the boundary must move inward. It must become psychological, moral, linguistic, religious. A wall of stone must become a wall of meaning. Now read Babel again. Humanity begins united. One language, one project, one collective purpose. They cross boundaries through communication. They accomplish something extraordinary through cooperation. And God stops them. How? Not with fire, not with disease, not by destroying every builder. The punishment is specifically designed to make cooperation impossible. Their language is confused. Understanding collapses. People separate. They scatter. Difference replaces unity. And here the interpretation proposed by the original argument becomes powerful. The punishment is also a prescription. The event in the mythical past tells the community in the historical present how to behave. Do not become one with them. Do not dissolve the distinction. Do not imagine that unlimited cooperation is automatically good. Do not abandon the barriers that make your people recognizable. Separation is not failure. Separation is obedience. If this reading is correct, Babel functions as cultural survival technology. The story tells endangered people that distinctiveness has cosmic approval. Imagine how effective that would be. A young exile wonders whether maintaining old customs is worth the trouble. Babel answers, God created separation. A family worries that its children are becoming indistinguishable from Babylonian neighbors. Babel answers, sameness is dangerous. Someone admires Babylon's achievements and asks why their own community should remain apart. Babel answers, remember what happened when humanity became one. Suddenly, social anxiety has been transformed into theology. The community no longer stays separate merely because elders are afraid. It stays separate because separation has been placed within the structure of sacred history. This is more powerful than command. People resist commands. Stories shape instinct. A command says, do not assimilate. A myth makes assimilation feel cosmically wrong. And once a moral boundary is placed inside the imagination, People carry it wherever they go. No guards are necessary. No walls, no army. The story travels inside them. That may be the true genius of Genesis 11 within this critical interpretation. The Tower of Babel was ostensibly about building upward, but psychologically, the story builds sideways. It constructs a barrier, not a tower of bricks, a wall of words, and that wall may have accomplished something astonishing. It may have helped a vulnerable community survive, which creates a far more difficult philosophical question than simply asking whether the story is historically true. What if a false or mythic story preserves something real? What if fear creates a narrative that saves a people? And what happens when the danger disappears but the story remains? This is where easy judgment becomes inadequate. It would be simple to call the writer dishonest and stop there. But Spinoza's philosophy invites something harder than condemnation: understanding. To understand an action is not necessarily to approve it. It is to discover the causes that made it intelligible. Imagine again the threatened community. Its homeland has been devastated. Its political structures are broken. Its children are surrounded by a more powerful culture. Its elders have watched other conquered peoples vanish into larger empires. From inside that situation, the fear of assimilation would not be irrational. It would be based on observable historical patterns. Communities disappear. Languages die. Rituals stop being practiced. Memories fade. Grandchildren become strangers to the world of their grandparents. So the author or community behind the tradition may have been responding to an actual existential danger. That changes the moral texture of the problem. Fear can distort truth while still responding to something real. A person fleeing danger may exaggerate every shadow, but the exaggeration does not prove there was no danger. Likewise, a community can construct exclusionary beliefs because it perceives a genuine threat to continuity. Spinoza would ask us to trace the chain of causes rather than merely declare heroes and villains. Defeat creates insecurity. Insecurity creates fear of disappearance. Fear creates pressure for separation. Separation requires moral justification. Myth provides that justification. The myth becomes sacred. Sacredness preserves the myth. And the preserved myth shapes generations born long after the original danger has disappeared. Cause leads to cause. Nothing arrives from nowhere. This way of thinking is central to Spinoza's larger conception of freedom. We often imagine freedom as acting without causes, but human beings are always embedded in causes. History affects us. Language affects us. Childhood affects us. Fear affects us. Institutions affect us. Stories told before our birth influence what feels obvious to us. The person who does not understand those causes may feel completely free while being moved by them. That is bondage through ignorance. The first movement toward freedom is not escaping causality. It is understanding more of what causes us to think, fear, desire, and judge as we do. Apply that principle to Babel. If you read the story simply as timeless revelation, its assumptions operate invisibly. Unity feels suspicious because God supposedly condemned it. Difference appears divinely mandated. The scattering of peoples becomes part of cosmic design. You inherit the emotional structure without seeing the historical fear that may have produced it. But once you uncover the possible cause, your relationship to the story changes. The story may still matter. It may still carry literary power. It may still tell us something profound about human ambition, identity, empire, memory, or difference. But it no longer commands interpretation in the same unquestioned way. Understanding loosens necessity at the psychological level. The wall becomes visible as a wall, and visible walls can be evaluated. This is where the success of the story becomes almost haunting, because according to the source's central argument, the strategy worked. The exiled community did not simply disappear into Babylon. Its identity endured. Babylon eventually lost political supremacy. Empires changed. Persia came, then other powers. Centuries passed. The Jewish people preserved an extraordinary degree of cultural and religious continuity across migrations, domination, displacement, and persecution. No single text can explain that survival. History is far more complex than one story. But narratives of distinction undoubtedly became part of the cultural architecture by which identity endured. And that creates a paradox. The wall may have protected. The wall may also have imprisoned. A structure built during crisis often remains after the crisis because institutions remember the solution more easily than they remember the original problem. Think about your own life. Perhaps at some moment you learned not to trust. That distrust protected you from someone dangerous. Years later, the dangerous person is gone, but the distrust remains. Now it isolates you from people who never harmed you. The defense was once rational. Its continued operation becomes destructive. Or perhaps you learned to stay silent in a volatile household. Silence kept you safe. Later, you enter relationships where speaking openly would be healthy. Yet your body still reacts as if honesty were dangerous. The original adaptation saved you. Then the adaptation outlived the environment that created it. Human cultures behave similarly. A rule can begin as survival and end as dogma. A boundary can begin as protection and end as prison. A story can begin as resistance and end as inherited fear. This is why the question, "Is Babel true?" is actually less interesting than another question. What does Babel continue to make people feel and do? A text has consequences independent of the intention of its original author. Once written, it enters new contexts. People translate it, preach it, teach it to children, use it to explain difference, use it to justify suspicion, use it to defend boundaries, use it to warn against human ambition, use it, perhaps, to imagine that cooperation itself requires divine restraint. The original Babylonian crisis disappears. The psychological pattern remains. And as the story enters Christianity and travels into cultures that have no direct connection to ancient Judean exile, the context becomes increasingly invisible. People inherit the command without inheriting the emergency. They live inside a wall built for someone else's captivity. That is the point at which survival mythology can become universal ideology. And here Spinoza's challenge becomes personal. How many beliefs inside you were built as defenses for problems you never experienced? How many fears were inherited rather than discovered? How many moral reactions entered your mind before you had language sophisticated enough to question them? How often have you mistaken cultural memory for eternal necessity? These are not questions only about the Bible. They are questions about the human mind. Every society gives its children stories before those children can evaluate them. Every identity transmits categories of loyalty and danger. Every community teaches what should inspire pride, shame, fear, admiration, and disgust. We do not begin as independent philosophers. We begin as inheritors. The question is, what happens when inheritance meets examination? And this brings us back to Spinoza's lens. Because the purpose of the lens is not merely to destroy belief. It is to separate what is there from what distortion makes us see. Spinoza's intellectual courage did not consist simply in rejecting religious authority. Rejection is easy. Understanding is difficult. His more radical move was methodological. He refused to treat Scripture as though it had fallen from the sky without history. He approached texts through language, authorship, context, political circumstance, and internal consistency. That shift sounds ordinary today because historical criticism has become familiar in many academic settings. In Spinoza's world, it threatened an entire structure of authority. If Scripture is a human historical document, then interpretation cannot be settled merely by declaring that every sentence possesses the same supernatural origin. Contradictions become evidence. Word choice becomes evidence. Political context becomes evidence. The emotional needs of communities become relevant. The interpreter is no longer asking only, "What eternal truth does this passage contain?" He is also asking, "What caused human beings to produce this passage in this form?" That second question transforms Babel. Return to the 5 fingerprints. First, bricks. The narrator pauses over building techniques that would have been mundane to the civilization using them. The detail suggests distance between observer and culture. Second, scale. The tower is mocked through the image of God descending to inspect what humans imagine reaches heaven. The conquered reverse humiliation through satire. Third, contradiction. Genesis 10 describes peoples according to their different languages. Genesis 11 opens with one language. The chapters preserve different ways of imagining linguistic diversity. Fourth, naming. Babylon's prestigious association with a divine gate is transformed through Hebrew wordplay into confusion. The conquered reshape the conqueror's memory. Fifth, divine anxiety. God appears concerned by unified human capacity and acts specifically to disrupt communication. Human political fear seems to have entered the portrait of heaven. Individually, each detail can perhaps be explained. Together, they form a pattern, and patterns are what reasoning seeks. We do not understand reality by staring at isolated facts. We understand by connecting causes. This is another deeply Spinozist principle. Suppose you see a leaf moving across the road. If you know nothing about wind, you might imagine the leaf possesses intention. It turns left, then right, then races forward. It seems to choose. But once you understand air currents, friction, weight, shape, and surrounding conditions, its movement becomes intelligible within a network of causes. The leaf has not become less real. It has become less mysterious. Likewise, locating scripture inside history does not make the text disappear. It makes its movement intelligible. Why this metaphor? Why this fear? Why this wordplay? Why this contradiction? Why this image of God? Perhaps because a historical community was being moved by forces larger than itself. Military defeat, cultural attraction, imperial power, generational change, anxiety over identity, the need for cohesion. The story becomes a response within that causal field. Seen this way, Babel is not absurd because ancient people were stupid. Quite the opposite. It becomes sophisticated. A narrative turns humiliation into moral victory. It turns weakness into chosenness. It converts separation from an unfortunate consequence of exile into a sacred principle. It transforms the conqueror's monument into a joke. It gives endangered people a reason not merely to remember who they were, but to feel that forgetting would violate the divine order. That is powerful cultural engineering, and perhaps this is why the word lie requires care. A myth does not have to function like a deliberate modern fraud. Human beings tell stories through which they organize reality. Stories compress fear, memory, identity, and moral instruction into forms people can remember. A community may preserve a narrative because it expresses what the community needs to remain coherent, not because someone sat alone, calculating how to deceive billions of future readers. But this does not eliminate the philosophical problem. A story can be understandable without being historically literal. It can be psychologically necessary without being metaphysically true. It can preserve a community without giving us an accurate picture of an infinite God. Survival and truth are different categories, and confusing them has consequences. Consider the fifth fingerprint again. If God is infinite, then the idea of divine insecurity becomes incoherent. An infinite reality cannot be diminished by human achievement because nothing stands outside infinity as a competing power. Human beings do not build outside nature. They build within nature. The bricks, intelligence, cooperation, desire, language, physical laws, and causal conditions enabling the tower all belong to the same order of existence. From a Spinozist perspective, there is no cosmic kingdom called humanity advancing against another kingdom called God. Humanity is part of nature. Our capacities are expressions within nature. Our reason does not insult the universe. Our cooperation does not threaten infinity. Our discoveries do not steal power from God. They unfold through the causal order that already contains us. This is why Spinoza's God differs so radically from the anxious ruler imagined by superstition. A ruler commands subjects. Nature produces modes. A ruler can lose territory. Infinity cannot. A ruler can become jealous. The eternal order has no rival. A ruler may fear what people accomplish together, but the very power through which people cooperate belongs to the same reality from which they arise. Once you see that distinction, the Babel deity begins to resemble not infinity, but monarchy. And perhaps that is because human beings repeatedly imagine ultimate reality through political analogies familiar to them. Kings rule from above, so God rules from above. Kings issue laws, so nature becomes legislation. Kings reward loyalty, so fortune becomes reward. Kings punish rebellion, so catastrophe becomes judgment. Kings fear coalitions, so unity becomes dangerous. The human political world is projected onto the cosmos. Then the projection returns with divine authority and reinforces the political psychology that created it. That circle can last centuries, until someone examines it, until someone asks what caused the image, until someone polishes the lens. And once the image becomes clear, the final problem is no longer what happened in ancient Babylon. The final problem is what we do with the story now. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is not that ancient people built walls of words. We still do it, constantly. We divide humanity through narratives. We inherit names for outsiders. We turn historical conflicts into moral essences. We teach children stories explaining why our people are trustworthy and their people are dangerous. We forget the event that created the boundary, but preserve the emotion. Then we call the emotion tradition. Sometimes those boundaries preserve valuable differences. Human unity does not require cultural sameness. A world in which every language, custom, memory, and local identity disappears into one homogeneous culture would not necessarily represent progress. Difference can enrich human life. The question is whether difference must depend on fear. That distinction matters. You can preserve identity without imagining contamination. You can love your culture without needing another culture to be cursed. You can speak your ancestral language without believing foreign languages threaten heaven. You can maintain boundaries without turning boundaries into metaphysical absolutes. You can cooperate across difference without becoming identical. This is where the inherited interpretation of Babel deserves serious re-examination. Maybe unity and sameness are not the same thing. Maybe cooperation does not require erasing distinction. Maybe diversity does not require mutual incomprehension. Maybe people can remain different and still understand one another. That possibility undermines the false choice at the heart of many tribal stories. Either remain separate or disappear. Human life is more complex. A musician does not lose individuality by joining an orchestra. The distinct note does not vanish because it participates in harmony. In fact, harmony exists only because difference remains. The problem is not unity. The problem is domination. The problem is when one voice forces every other voice to become itself. If Babylon represented that kind of imperial absorption, then resistance to assimilation becomes understandable. But resistance to domination is not the same as hostility toward cooperation. And a survival story born in one context should not automatically become a universal rule for every context. This is precisely where reason becomes liberating. Reason asks us to distinguish. What conditions created the belief? Do those conditions still exist? What function did the belief serve? Does it serve the same function now? What consequences follow when we preserve it unquestioned? These questions do not destroy meaning. They refine it. A mature relationship with inherited tradition should be capable of making distinctions that childhood cannot make. As children, we receive stories whole. Good people, bad people. God approves. God condemns. Obey. Avoid. Remember. As adults, if we choose to think, we begin separating layers. Literature, history, political memory, psychology, theology, myth, moral instruction, cultural survival, metaphysical claim. Those layers can coexist within the same passage. The need to declare a text either completely divine or completely worthless is itself a symptom of simplistic thinking. Spinoza offers another possibility. Understand the document according to its causes, then evaluate its ideas through reason. The text does not need supernatural perfection to be historically important. It does not need literal divine authorship to reveal the anxieties of human civilization. In fact, its humanity may make it more interesting. Babel then becomes a window into how defeated communities reconstruct meaning, how memory fights power, how language becomes resistance, how fear becomes doctrine, how doctrine preserves identity, and how successful adaptations become prisons when they survive beyond their original environment. That is far more psychologically complex than people became proud and God punished them, and it places responsibility back on us. Because once you know that stories have causes, you cannot simply inherit their conclusions without examination. You must ask, what emotions are being transmitted to me? Whose fear am I carrying? Whose enemy have I been taught to recognize? What ancient emergency is still controlling my imagination? And perhaps the hardest question, what parts of my identity depend upon continuing to misunderstand someone else? That question reaches far beyond religion. Nations construct identity this way. Families do it. Political movements do it. Institutions do it. Individuals do it. We tell ourselves stories about people who hurt us. Sometimes those stories are accurate enough to protect us. But over time, the person changes, the circumstances change, and the narrative becomes rigid. We stop responding to reality. We respond to memory. For Spinoza, this is what it means to be governed by passive affects. An external encounter produces an emotion. The emotion shapes an image. The image continues influencing us. We react without understanding why. Freedom grows when the chain becomes visible, not because the past disappears, not because emotion disappears, but because knowledge changes our relation to emotion. A fear understood is different from a fear obeyed blindly. An inherited story, recognized as inherited, no longer possesses exactly the same authority. A wall seen as historically constructed no longer feels like part of the natural landscape. This may explain why Spinoza's method provoked such hostility. The threat was not merely that he disagreed with certain interpretations. He changed the location of authority. If texts must be examined historically, then institutions cannot simply end every question by declaring sacredness. If human beings can investigate how a belief arose, fear loses some of its power, and institutions built on unquestioned interpretation naturally resist that shift. Spinoza himself paid a severe social price for his intellectual independence. He lived outside the communal structures in which he had been raised. He worked quietly. He wrote cautiously. He examined religious and political authority with a rigor that made him dangerous, precisely because he was not merely shouting against religion. He was asking for consistency, clear definitions, freedom of thought. He did not want the mind governed by superstition. And superstition, in his analysis, feeds most easily on uncertainty and fear. When people are afraid, they become desperate for interpretations. They want signs. They want cosmic approval. They want assurance that their suffering has meaning and their enemies deserve what is coming. Fear makes the imagination fertile. Power can then cultivate that imagination. This does not require conspiracies. It requires only ordinary human psychology. The frightened mind wants certainty. The authoritative story supplies it. The story becomes sacred because sacredness protects certainty. And then questioning the story feels like questioning reality itself. But reality does not need protection from questions. Only fragile interpretations do. Which is why the last movement of Babel is not really about exposing an ancient author. It is about deciding whether we are willing to see our own fingerprints on the gods we create. Return one final time to the tower. Picture it not as a cartoon stretching absurdly into the clouds, but as a human monument rising over an ancient city. Workers carry materials. Administrators organize labor. Craftsmen understand techniques inherited across generations. Priests interpret sacred space. Merchants move through streets. Children grow up beneath walls built before they were born. Exiles arrive carrying memories of another homeland. Some are frightened. Some are fascinated. Some resent the empire. Some adapt. Some fall in love with the city they were supposed to hate. Some desperately try to preserve what their parents taught them. This is no longer a simple moral fable. It is human history. Messy, causal, ambiguous. A building can represent oppression to one person and sacred achievement to another. A language can represent opportunity to one generation and cultural extinction to another. Integration can feel like liberation to an individual while appearing as disappearance to a community. Separation can preserve identity while also producing suspicion. No single slogan captures all of that. And perhaps that complexity is precisely what childhood readings remove. Pride Caused Babel gives us an easy lesson. Historical examination gives us responsibility. Once the text becomes human, we must think. We cannot simply outsource judgment to the narrator. We have to ask whether the narrator's fear should become ours. And now the 5 fingerprints can be seen as parts of one larger human drama. The fascination with bricks reveals an outsider encountering a technologically impressive culture. The comic descent of God reverses the humiliating scale of imperial power. The contradiction between linguistic diversity in Genesis 10 and linguistic unity in Genesis 11 suggests layered traditions rather than seamless dictation. The transformation of Babylon's sacred name into a pun about confusion turns language into cultural revenge. The anxious God of verse 6 reflects a fear that makes far more sense in a threatened human community than in an infinite being. Then the underlying motive emerges. Survival. A people fears disappearance. It creates meaning strong enough to resist absorption. The story works. And because it works, it survives the crisis that created it. That is the paradox. Human beings often survive because of stories. But the fact that a story helped us survive does not establish that every claim inside it is eternally true. This distinction may be one of the most important intellectual habits a person can develop. Gratitude does not require submission. You can recognize that an inherited belief protected your ancestors without allowing it to govern every future generation. You can honor what a story accomplished without pretending that its worldview is beyond examination. You can understand why a wall was built and still decide that a door is now necessary. Spinoza's philosophy points toward this kind of maturity. Freedom is not the destruction of all limits. It is not doing whatever impulse demands. It is not screaming rebellion at every tradition. Freedom grows from adequate understanding. To understand why you feel something, why you believe something, why a story became sacred. why a community needed it, why you inherited it, and whether the causes that once justified it still operate now. The more clearly you understand causes, the less completely you are ruled by effects you cannot name. That principle applies even to fear of God. If your image of God depends on insecurity, jealousy, rivalry, anger, and the need to suppress human power, ask where those characteristics came from. Are they properties of infinity or properties of political rulers? Are they revelations about the structure of existence or enlargements of human emotion? If God is truly infinite, then human intelligence cannot threaten God. Human cooperation cannot diminish God. Scientific understanding cannot overthrow God. A tower cannot approach God spatially, because infinity is not a king living at a physical altitude. From a Spinozist perspective, the very framework collapses. You are not standing outside nature trying to invade it. You are within nature. Your body belongs to it. Your mind belongs to it. Your reason belongs to it. Your errors belong to it. Your discoveries unfold within it. Even your desire to understand is an expression of the same reality you are attempting to understand. There is no cosmic border checkpoint where human knowledge becomes too powerful and the universe becomes nervous. The greater danger lies in ignorance, because ignorance allows imagination to become fear. Fear becomes superstition. Superstition becomes authority. Authority protects the fear that created it. Understanding interrupts the cycle. And now perhaps you can see why the image of the lens matters so much. A lens does not create the object. It corrects the distortion between the eye and the object. That is what critical thought can do with inherited stories. You do not have to burn the story. You do not have to mock the people who believed it. You do not have to replace one dogma with another. You simply look again, more carefully, with fewer assumptions. The bricks remain. The tower remains. The contradictory chapters remain. The wordplay remains. The frightened portrait of God remains. But now you see the possible human conditions behind them, and once causes become visible, the story cannot exercise exactly the same power. That is why some discoveries feel irreversible. You can return to the passage. You can hear it read aloud. You can watch someone explain it in the old way. But somewhere inside your mind, another question will remain active. Whose voice am I hearing? What historical fear is speaking? What does this story need me to believe? What becomes possible if I refuse to inherit that fear automatically? That is not cynicism. It is intellectual responsibility. And perhaps it is also a deeper form of respect for truth. Truth should not depend on our refusal to investigate. If a belief survives only because questions are forbidden, its fragility has already been revealed. Reality has nothing to fear from clarity. So we arrive at the wall. Not the walls of Babylon, not the ruined walls of Jerusalem. A different wall, one made of memory, fear, language, and sacred authority. According to the interpretation developed throughout this script, that is what Genesis 11 ultimately constructed. The story appears to describe a tower, but its lasting achievement is separation. It tells us why humanity speaks differently. It turns Babylon's prestige into shame. It mocks imperial greatness. It gives a vulnerable people theological reasons to remain distinct. And perhaps, in its original environment, that wall was extraordinarily useful. It may have strengthened people who were afraid of disappearing. It may have helped parents transmit memory. It may have given exiles a way to reinterpret defeat without surrendering identity. It may have transformed humiliation into resistance. If so, the writer was not simply foolish. He understood something profound about human beings. People can live behind words more effectively than they can live behind stone. Destroy a physical wall and the population can cross it. Build the wall inside identity and people carry it themselves. The most durable boundaries are internal. That insight explains why stories can outlive empires. Babylon fell. Its rulers disappeared. Its political structures became archaeology, but Babel remained. The tower continued rising inside imagination, long after the physical monument ceased to dominate the skyline. Generation after generation inherited the story. Languages changed. Religions expanded. Empires converted. Continents that had never experienced Babylonian exile received the same narrative. People separated from the original crisis by thousands of years learned that human unity once frightened heaven. The defense mechanism became universal memory. And this is where the wall becomes philosophically dangerous. Walls do not know why they were built. They simply remain until someone examines them. The human mind often behaves the same way. You inherit a fear. You forget its origin. Then you defend it because it feels like part of you. You inherit a distinction. You forget the historical conflict that produced it. Then you call the distinction natural. You inherit an interpretation. You forget that someone interpreted the story before you. Then you call the interpretation revelation. The past becomes invisible precisely when it becomes most powerful. Spinoza's method reverses that invisibility. Trace the belief backward. Find the causes. Examine the language. Compare passage. Study the historical situation. Notice contradictions instead of hiding them. Ask what emotions are being projected. Ask who benefits from a particular interpretation. Not because every inherited belief is false, but because no belief deserves exemption from understanding. That is the true challenge left by the lens grinder. He could polish glass so that distant objects came into focus. His philosophical project attempted something similar with human thought. Remove distortion. Reduce superstition. Replace fear with understanding. Do not ask reality to conform to inherited imagination. Allow understanding to change the imagination. And perhaps that is the point at which Babel finally stops being merely a story about an ancient tower. It becomes a test. Can you examine something you were taught to revere without immediately becoming defensive? Can you admit that a sacred story may contain political memory? Can you distinguish psychological usefulness from metaphysical truth? Can you understand why frightened people created boundaries without making their fear your permanent inheritance? Can you preserve difference without worshiping separation? Can you cooperate without demanding sameness? Can you question without needing to hate? Those questions are more difficult than, was the tower real? They concern the kind of mind you are willing to have. A passive mind receives. An active mind investigates. A frightened mind asks which authority will protect certainty. A freer mind asks, what causes produced the certainty in the first place? And here we should avoid one final mistake. Do not replace the old dogmatism with a new one. It would be easy to hear everything we have discussed and declare that we now possess the final secret of Genesis 11. We do not. Historical texts are complicated. Ancient authorship is complicated. Traditions develop across time. Motives can be mixed. A story may carry several meanings at once. Critical thinking is not the habit of becoming certain about the opposite of whatever you were taught. It is the discipline of proportioning confidence to understanding. That may be the most Spinozist conclusion available. Less fear, less accusation, less inherited certainty, more causes, more context, more clarity, more intellectual freedom. The original Babel story ends with scattering. Perhaps our examination can end differently. Not with humanity becoming one identical people. Not with every language disappearing. Not with every tradition collapsing into one worldview. But with understanding becoming possible across difference. Imagine that. Distinct people who can still communicate. Different traditions capable of examining themselves. Communities strong enough to preserve identity without needing contempt. Individuals able to honor ancestors without inheriting all their fears. Unity without uniformity. Difference without hostility. Cooperation without absorption. That would not be the destruction of Babel's diversity. It would be the overcoming of Babel's confusion. And perhaps the most important wall is the one inside us that says, understanding another person requires becoming that person. It does not. You can understand without surrendering yourself. You can investigate without betraying your heritage. You can discover that your ancestors were human without ceasing to respect what they endured. You can recognize that a story served survival without mistaking survival for eternal truth. So return to those 9 verses whenever you wish, but read them slowly. Notice the bricks. Notice God coming down. Turn back to Genesis 10. Listen to the languages already present there. Remember the gate. Listen carefully when divine speech begins sounding like human anxiety. Then ask what fear could connect all of it. And finally, turn the question toward yourself. What walls are still standing in your mind because someone before you needed them? Which of those walls still protect something valuable? Which now merely restrict your view? What beliefs would change if you understood the historical causes that produced them? What fear would lose its authority if you could finally name where it came from? And most importantly, once you have looked through the lens, can you choose to see the old picture exactly as you saw it before? Some ideas become weaker when their origins become visible. Some inherited fears lose their sacred appearance once we understand the human conditions that created them. And some walls, once we realize they were built from words, no longer appear impossible to cross. The author of Babel may have needed that wall. His community may have needed it. Perhaps it even helped them survive. But you are living in another world. You inherit the story. You do not have to inherit the fear. So if you grew up hearing the Tower of Babel as a simple warning about human pride, ask yourself one final question. When you read it now, what do you see that you could not see before? And if the answer changed while you were listening, write that realization down. Not because someone told you what you must believe, but because the beginning of intellectual freedom is recognizing the moment when you finally started examining why you believed it.